I'm Maggie. I'm a licensed clinical psychotherapist with degrees in psychology, theology, and marriage and family therapy, a national certification in dialectical behavioral therapy, and a national certification in integrative mental health. In this video, I'm not looking to diagnose anyone. I'm only willing to offer insight into situations like these. All right, so today we're going to talk about how the modern Jews of today, which are primarily all Ashkenazi, okay, that's who we're talking about, are from Japheth's line. We're going to continue on that. They are not from Shem's line, so, this anti-Semitism that they talk about doesn't really fit. But first, before we get into it, let me say hi to some folks who are here first. Adric is number one. He is here first, jabbing at Adrian. Adrian is in here second. Leon is here. What's up with you? Indigo Flow is here. So we're ready to get started. And for those of you who are watching from the clouds, this is the best live tribe on YouTube. So please feel free to make a comment. You will be welcomed as long as you're appropriate. And shout out to the replay gang. So we are going to have a tinfoil hat segment. So for those of you that love the tinfoil hat segment, it's happening today, and it's going to be kind of a big one. So hopefully you stick around for that. Chef Mike is here. Spain Man is here. The gang's all here. All right. So since I'm going to be talking about modern Jewry, I have to put up my disclaimer because there's always somebody that's going to come in and say things that are not true. I am talking about Jewry. I am not being anti-Semitic. So I'm going to play my little disclaimer real quick. It is not anti-Semitic to point out that certain elites throughout history, including the Khazar ruling class, have strategically adopted Judaism not as a matter of faith, but as a tool for political sovereignty, identity control, and economic insulation. Just as the Vatican weaponized Christianity to justify imperial expansion and the British crown cloaked colonization in divine monarchy, some elite families used Jewish identity not to elevate a people, but to shield their own power. Critiquing those historical power moves is not a hatred of Jews. It is a rejection of using any religion, Judaism included, as a camouflage for conquest, manipulation, and unearned legitimacy. If you can call out papal tyranny without being anti-Christian or condemn Western colonialism without being anti-European, then you can damn well expose elite identity fraud without being anti-Semitic. The real anti-Semitism is pretending all Jewish people share the guilt of a few who turned sacred identity into a political weapon. There's my disclaimer. All right. Thank God we got that out of the way. All right. So today the beginning part of this, we're going to look at an article. This article, well, it's from a journal. So it's in academia. It is 10 years old, but it's something that's not commonly spoke about. So we're going to go through just a little bit of that pretty quickly. We're going to go through some information. We're going to get a little bit deeper. And then we're going to have tinfoil hat time. So hopefully everybody can stick around for that. So let me get this article up here. So what this article is about is it's talking about migration from the steppe that brought Indo-European languages to Europe. So if you have been watching my shows of late, we've been talking a lot about the homeland of the Neanderthal, Gothic, Khazarian. They all seem to constantly come out of the same area, which is this, the steppes. This is by Russia, Ukraine, Turkey. This is this area that always seems to be the hotbed of the Neanderthals, the Goths, the Khazarians. So, and I'm not saying that every Neanderthal today is a Khazarian, because we know that is not true as well. So this is talking about people who migrated from the Eurasian steppe to Central Europe. Okay, so this would be, we're not talking necessarily about England right away. We're talking about like Germany. Okay, which another hotbed of Neanderthal DNA. So there's talks about how a lot of the languages come from this Indo-European, right? And so they think it's from a massive migration from the Russian steppe. This is what we've been talking about, right? So when we go through here, okay, so they're talking about the genome, all right? But this is where we're getting into the important part. By studying genome scale data from more than 90 ancient European individuals ranging from 3,000 to 8,000 years old, the study documents two major population what? Replacements. And isn't that always the play? Right? We've called it identity theft. We've called it different things, but it's replacement. And the interesting thing is the article says replacements and then literally talks about how the original people didn't ever leave. Okay. So the first was the arrival of Europe's first farmers who expanded from the Near East 9,000 years ago and reached Central Europe and the Iberian Peninsula by 7,500 years ago. So it took 1,500 years. Okay. So some archaeologists have said that though the migrations were unrelated to each other, that they're two different things, but genetic says differently. And it's interesting that they start out with the first farmers, the first farmers. They're like, this is the first migration, the first farmers. The hunter-gatherers had already come into that land. And those people started from Central Africa up through Mesopotamia, Sumeria, back down and around. And those were who we referred to as the indigenous of Europe, the Britons, Britons. So if you have questions about that, I already did a show on it. So those hunter-gatherers, you can look up Chatterman, were dark-skinned and light-eyed. Okay, so this is saying, the first migration of farmers. Well, the hunter-gatherers were already there, and they will admit it later. So here we go. The hunter-gatherers that lived in Europe before the first farmers did not disappear. Oh, but we called it replacement up here, right? So by 6,000 to 5,000 years ago, a resurgence of the hunter-gatherer ancestry had occurred in agricultural populations across Europe. These are the Cheddarmen, right? These are the dark-skinned, light-eyed. These are the descendants of those people got bottlenecked onto wells, or what they call the island, Kimraig. And that genetic information is still there. This is direct descendants into these very freckled people. So this person is saying, the resurgence happened. This shows that populations with substantial hunter-gatherer ancestry persisted in parts of Europe even after the arrival of the first farmers. So a way to think about this is like if we think about the United States, right? So these Europeans came in, they were replacing, right? They were committing genocides and kicking people off the land, right? But those Aboriginal Americans, Native Americans, to a certain extent, didn't go anywhere, right? They're still there, whether we're talking about the Siberian natives or the Afro-Indigenous natives, since we've talked about the two different parts. So the hunter-gatherers had been slowly but steadily integrated into these farming communities, except there was a bottleneck on wells on that island. So they talk here, this massive migration, right? Several of the same authors had shown that Europeans today are a mixture of three very different ancestral populations. This is what I've been saying. So when I talk about the way that the story of how hominids developed, the way that was told was kind of metaphorically, right? We don't know if a man actually named Noah existed or if he had three sons, right? Japheth, Shem, and Ham. But this is a story of the first hominids. The Noetic line produced the Homo sapiens, the Neanderthals, and the Denisovans, right? Ham being Homo sapien, made for this planet, right? Shem being more, no, I'm sorry, I had that backwards. Ham being Denisovan, which I never really got into on this channel. I hadn't much talked about the Denisovans, but I did talk about the Hamites and their knowledge of technology. So Hamites, Denisovans, Shemites, the Homo sapien hominids, and Japheth, the Neanderthals, right? And it even says in the writing, right? The Hamites were black as a raven. The Shemites were black and beautiful, or what they say, comely in the writings. And Japheth was made white. So the only hominids who sprung forth already white and not from a birth defect, not from a DNA defect or mutation, were the Neanderthals. So this is a metaphoric way to talk about these three lines. And then they get weaponized. Okay. So this is talking about, as I have been saying, this Neanderthalic line that is a hotbed, and the DNA shows in the Goths. The Nazis and Hitler even told you that the Neanderthals were the Aryans. The Goths migrated in, right, into Germany, Neanderthalic, and then they came into the whole rest of Europe, took over England, all of those things. In fact, the royal family today says they are from the House of Windsor, right? And they live in the Windsor Castle. The castle was named Windsor before they decided to change their name, which they did with Elizabeth, right? So very recently, the queen who just died, they were from the House of Gotha, Gotha. When they started warring with Germany, they decided that wasn't a good look to be from the House of Gotha, the Goths, right? And so they named their name after their castle, the House of Windsor. So these are the things that I've been saying, is that there are these three very distinct lines that are in our world today. And so we can look at these ancient writings and kind of know what's going on. Okay. Was there anything else I wanted to go through? So it does talk about the new study doesn't solve the centuries-old problem of the location of the homeland of all Indo-European languages. If we look at how the Neanderthals migrated, how Goths migrated, where they all settled, which was all the same places, just thousands of years apart, we see that it came from that Ukrainian, Turkic, Caucasus Mountain steppe, where the Circassians, or what we call Caucasians, white Caucasians now. So, and of course, this is being done in German universities, so that's super interesting. That it's Germany, the hotbed of Neanderthalic DNA, is the one doing this. Okay, let me look at some comments, because when I was looking at the article, couldn't see. Yeah, Indigo Flow says Turkey. Exactly. Germania. Yep. And we're going to get deeper into it. Inspired Truth. He's going to be on the replay, gang. Thank you for being here. Leon says, I always think of hunter-gatherers settled down in farming communities as they age or seek safely with people they trade meat with, even through ideas of marriage and training the young, titled chiefs, those kind of things. Vincent is here. Hi, Vincent. You could be right. I mean, I think hunter-gatherers, we've been conditioned to think of them as less evolved, but hunter-gatherers are living 100% in communion with the earth. They're not forcing or making the earth or any of the animals in it do anything other than what it was intended to do and what it does naturally. So I think that seems to be almost actually the baseline of humanity. And then if people wanted or needed to build on that because they didn't want to leave the land they were on, they wanted to do things differently, hunting grounds changed, that's when they added agriculture to that. So that is the article. If you guys want to look at this article, or anybody who gives really good information, Max Planck, Planck, gives good info. This is from March 2nd, 2015. This is the website. and the title. If you want to read it a little closer, you can read that a little closer. So let me get into this other. Okay. So I don't have a lot of images for this one because this is going to be more of talking. We looked at this article and what it says and what it meant. And these are the things that, I've been talking about as of late because I think they're so very important to what's going on right now, is to understand these lines and what they mean and what they're doing and why. Okay. So, I've been talking about the bloodlines, right? And it's not me that made up bloodlines, right? It's the Goths that made up the bloodlines, right? It's the Neanderthal Gothic elite who made up blue bloods and royal bloodlines. They did that. I'm just talking about it, right? And we also talk about the Shemitic bloodline. And they even talk about it in the Curse of Ham, right? And they talk about that bloodline, but I've talked about it before. The curse of Ham never existed. Ham was never cursed, nor was his line. His son Canaan was cursed because Noah was drunk and couldn't see. So, in my thesis, okay, in what I'm trying to tell you, Shem was supposed to bring in spirituality, right? Soul. The spirit of who we are, the soul of who we are, and all of that comes with that. Ham was to bring technology. So that Hamite line brought technology in. And Japheth's line was supposed to bring infrastructure. That's what Japheth was supposed to bring to humanity, or his lineage. Okay. The Caucasus and Anatolia, Turkey, okay, were Japhethite strongholds, right? These are the ancestors of the Neanderthal Gothic bloodlines who moved west into Europe while also extending east into the steppes. Okay. Shemitic and Hamitic groups were already flowing through Mesopotamia, Iran, the Indus Valley. They were already in and out there. Okay. Their genetic and cultural interactions fused with some of the Japhethites along trade and migration routes, leaving traces in Europe. Okay. I'm never saying that Japheth's line is pure evil, that all of them are pure evil. That's not the case. And it's a little too simplistic, right? But there are some Japhethites that they themselves are pretty evil. Leon says they have videos on YouTube on how the English language changed. It seems 100% different from the start to now, as if multiple races mixed. Now, the British English sounds like fast Southern Americans. It does. It does. And I was even talking the other day about how spelling has changed, how the country of Chad used to be spelled with a T, T-C-H-A-D. The Eskimo, which I realize is derogatory towards the Inuit north, but it used to be spelled Esquimaux. Looks much more native, doesn't it? The Esquimaux or Esquimaux. So things have changed. I think a lot of times things have been dumbed down, because the dumbing of America is a thing. Okay. So the Shemitic and Hamitic groups were already flowing into that region. But remember, the Neanderthals, when we look at ancient Neanderthals and the Goths and, their progeny, they never want to intermix. They only do it when they have to. And that's why they bottlenecked several times over the years. That's how we get blue bloods and Rh negative and a lot of these immuno disorders and diseases because of these genetic bottlenecks. And they did it, recently, right? Like 1700s, 1800s, marry your cousin, marry your sister. We got to keep the bloodline pure. Okay. So The Pontic Caspian steppe, which is on the north side of the Caucasus Mountains, was a key corridor where the horse riding nomads emerged. So we get these horse riding nomads that just come out of the Caucasus Mountains. Those groups carried language and cultural frameworks that stretched west into Europe. These are the early Celts, the Proto-Germanics, and the Slavs. Okay. They went east into Iran and India. This is the Indo-Iranians and the Vedic tribes. Okay. The theory of inheritance lines mixing is where we see this. Japheth's infrastructure, so we have wagons, fortresses, organized migrations, carried Hamite technologies, so we have metallurgy and agriculture, and Shemitic spirituality, so we have ritual law and cosmology. All of those things were operating together very well, okay? And there are some ancient civilizations where we see the perfect fusion of those lines, what it was supposed to look like. We see it in these ancient civilizations. But the Japheth line was seduced and became drunk on power. Prince Harry and Meghan, yeah, we're mixing some lineage there. But you can already tell that there's some lineage mixing, probably from Princess Diana, because of the red hair. Red hair is not Neanderthal. Neanderthals are blondes. Oopsie. And the freckles. The freckles is a big giveaway. So we have dragon and serpent symbolism that we can track, right? This spiritual symbolism. It's shared across Anatolia, Iran, India, and Europe. It's not coincidence, right? I've shown this before when I talked about Tartaria. It's an older shared archetype tied to this technology and these certain god and goddess archetypes. But the dragon, as an archetype, we can literally watch it as it migrates and ends up in North America. It's a big empire called Tartaria, the Tartarian Empire. They have a flag. And then we're told Tartaria is a myth until Russia starts talking about Tartaria. And then we're told, no, it never existed in North America, even though it was on, 1,500 flags. But so I want to talk about sacred mountains for just a second, right? And the axis mundi, because something that is shared is always these mountains, okay? So from the Caucasus Mountains, which is where Mount Ararat is, to Iran, which is where Zagros is, to India, which is where Mount Meru is, to Europe, which is where Mount Olympus and the Alps, right? These are a repeat of these sacred mountains. And I've talked about it before because these mountains came from an original mountain range in Pangaea, right? Now, what Africa is the very center of Pangaea, which is when we had all one continent and they broke apart, right? But all of these mountains came from the original Pangaea. And when we watch the migration of these people, they are continuously naming a sacred mountain. And for some reason, it's always the mountains that were connected to the mountain range of Pangaea. Leon says, when you go back 1,000 years, it seems as if all kings or monarchs carry all of their surnames. It's interesting. I'm not sure what you mean, Leon. I'm not sure what you mean. So then we have the Black Sea, the Caspian, Anatolian corridor. Okay. It was a genetic and cultural funnel. We have the movement of metallurgy. We have bronze, later iron from Anatolia and Iran into Europe. We have the flow of crops and agricultural methods, with wheat and barley and teaching irrigation all went across this arc. Maritime trade from Turkey, Ionia into the Aegean and the Balkans fed into Europe. This is these migrations that are going in. This corridor also carried the bloodlines. The Rh negative factors trace through the Gothic steppe elites into Europe, while the Semitic and Hamitic markers extend into Iran and India. So this is where we're separating, right? Don't know what the fallout was. Don't know what the problem was, but this is where we're separating, okay? So there are some archetypal links here. So we have Greek gods, Zeus, Apollo, Athena, echo the Anatolian and Near Eastern deities of Tarhun, Teshub, Indra, and Ishtar. Same people, different name. Indo-European pantheons in India and Iran, remember where those people went? We have the Vedic devas, Zoroastrian ahuras, and those all preserve the same mythos that reshaped into European pagan gods later. Okay. These were not separate inventions, but the inheritance of kind of when Anu, of the Anunnaki, right? The sons of Anu divided. Okay. Different Elohim, that's what they're called in Hebrew, were assigned different territories, but people carried the same archetypes, east and west. Difference in language, not difference in ideas. We're not going to talk about that, Vincent, at all. I'm not touching that. Leon says, for example, the Rothschilds settled on that name, but if you go back 200 to 300 years ago, their grandmother had 7 or 8 surnames, house names. Yeah, because, excuse me, prior, your name or like what you put on your shield showed your bloodline inheritance, showed that you were a blue blood and how far back you could date. That's why it's always the house of. So think about the royals now, the house of Gotha. They are the Goth, okay? The Goths never fell. Just like I say, Rome never fell. And I'll talk about that in a minute too. Adrian says, I'm typing this as I'm currently existing 3 minutes in the past. The term Eskimo was a label given by the French, which would track with them having a name that ended with MAUX. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. But we, changed it to a phonetic spelling, right? But then the Inuit are like, we're not that. What are you talking about? So we're going to talk about a little bit of suppressed history, right? Because that exists. We know that exists, right? Ancient Black African civilizations, Kemet, Nubia, had long-standing ties eastward. These are trade ties, all right? They had Pythagoras studied there. The Moors came in and out of there. And even there are some Tartarian overlays into Kemet and Nubia. Okay, these links were later overwritten with these imperial narratives of the people who went that way after the divide, right? The Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, and the Europeans. That's who those folks are. Okay, but the deep memory, it's almost like we keep asking these questions because we know it doesn't sound right. We see it in the language, we see it in DNA, we see it in symbols. It proves that the unity of Europe, Anatolia, the Caucasus, Iran, India, all of that had to do with this hominid split, where the Japhethites, the Goths, the Neanderthals went one way and everybody else went the other. Okay, so we can even look at this in enslavement. Okay, so during the time of chattel slavery, when Europeans were operating in chattel slavery and were trafficking human beings, when they would go into Africa, they would gather up the males to go into chattel slavery because they were going to go work on plantations and whatnot. They were not looking for females. But where did the females and the children go? To the Arabs. The Arabs enslaved the females and the children. These were concubines, okay? and the children were neutered and became eunuchs for the Arabs. Same people, same bloodline, doing the same or similar stuff. Okay. Adrian says, woohoo, I'm caught back up now. 1,000 years of history in 6 minutes. You did just time travel. For sure, for sure. Okay. So Europe 3,000 to 6,000 years ago was not just this isolated place. It was tied to this massive corridor stretching from Turkey to the Caucasus to Iran to India. The corridor carried the Japhethite infrastructure, the Hamitic technology, and the Shemitic spirituality, creating the Indo-European expansion. Just two different ways. We're going to go our separate way. Myths, bloodlines, the Rh negative elites, the Hebrew signals that we see, sacred mountain memory, and a lot of these dragon and even goddess symbols are evidence of that original unity. The Gothic influx was the destabilizing moment. And it makes sense when we track it across the theory. Okay, so we're going to do that real quick. Goths are Neanderthal coded elites. Okay. I'm not saying that other people don't have Neanderthal blood. Of course they do. There was some mixing. Okay. Again, it's like saying not all white people. Okay. Not all Neanderthals. So they mixed with Rh negative blood. They also always, the Neanderthals and the Goths always had a fixation on bloodline preservation, exactly like the royals who are Gothic to this day. Their arrival in Europe wasn't just a migration, right? It was a takeover of the inheritance line, okay? The Goths carried the Japhethite archetype of infrastructure and domination. But since they split off, they didn't have the balance of Shem's spirituality and Ham's technology. So they had to steal those things, okay? The result is that Europe tilted towards cold empire building, colonization, and hierarchical caste systems because they split off. Okay, so let's talk 3,000 to 2,000 years ago, which in the grand scheme of things isn't that long ago. So in early Europe, this is like the Bronze and Iron Age, it still reflected this Indo-European unity with Anatolia, with the Caucasus, with Iran, with India. They had shared pantheons, they had steppe technologies, they had mixed bloodlines. Things were in balance then. But beginning around the first millennium BCE and accelerating into the first century CE, waves of Gothic and steppe tribes entered Europe from the northeast. This is waves. This is the big migration. They had been coming in. This is the big migration. Hi, Wiedemann 1111. I don't know if the name Aaron comes from the word from Iran. It really could. It really could. Somebody should ask their AI, their favorite AI, that question and see what it comes up with. Put it in the chat. Adrian says, I laugh whenever people look at European society as rigid peoples that didn't mix. You can see it in their food, etc. I like when I ask a Mexican if they know where El Pastor meat comes from or why they're called Latin or Spanish. How did that happen? Okay, so they absorbed, right, and replaced earlier Indo-European elements, but reoriented them into these warlord dynasties. Rome's fall, when they were sacked by the Goths in 410 CE, is the most famous sign of this big divergence, right? But Rome never actually fell. It became the Roman Catholic Empire, right? The Holy Roman Empire. And I say this a lot. If the Goths actually won over Rome, right? Why the hell would they allow them to continue their religion and for their religion to be a world religion unless they actually took over the religion so that they could have a Holy Roman Emperor? So Rome didn't fall, the empire with an emperor, right? And this emperor, having an emperor that all the kings deferred to, went well into the making of the United States of America. It didn't fall for a while, okay? The Goths didn't topple Rome, right? They brought the rigid hierarchy and elitism. They preserved that in medieval nobility and monarchies. This is the medieval times, by the way. This big divergence is happening during medieval times, okay? Suppression of older spiritual systems, the Indo-European pantheons, the goddess cults, the Semitic spiritual stuff is replaced by authoritarian Christianity aligned with the Gothic bloodline elites. Remember the right of rule, the God-given right of rule, and that the rulers had God's ear, okay? God put them on the throne. Displacement of indigenous Europeans, right, which is the Celts, the Etruscans, the Basque, the Britons, and other groups were pushed into the margins or reclassified. Adrian says, exactly. Why would the Pope be the foreign policy for the world if they fell? If you took over a country, how the hell are you going to let them have that much power? Absolutely not, unless you co-opt that power for yourself, or you just merge it all together, okay? Now, Europe lost its older balance of the three inheritances, right? Shem, spirit; Ham, technology; Japheth, infrastructure, okay? The Gothic dominance then produced crusades, Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior or die, okay? Colonialism, empire building, the double caste system. This is when this started, and we still have it in operation today. The elite Gothic bloodlines are on top, and there's a hierarchy there, okay? All the subjected peoples are in a whole other caste system below. It's two different pyramids, one pyramid on top of a bigger pyramid. Okay, we see this on the dollar. The cold imperialistic orientation that later extended into the Americas, Africa, and Asia. This is what we got from the Gothic takeover. Indigo says, oh, he's answering Wiedemann 1111. I don't think there's any etymological link between the two names. Darn, that would have been cool. Wiedemann 1111 says you'll be surprised. Yeah, we may. I mean, Indigo flows. He says I don't think, but there's so much suppressed information. It's like we can't ever be 100% positive sure about much, right? We have to have it sort of confirmed in writing, confirmed in oral stories that were passed down, confirmed in DNA, confirmed spiritually for us to say, okay, this has got to be true. It's got to be true. Okay. So Adrian says, if anything, Rome became more powerful by subjecting the European tribes to being tools for Roman world domination. Exactly. This is the first use of weaponizing religion. It's the first time it happened. Okay. Christianity is still weaponized to today, but it was weaponized many, many, many times. Judaism has been weaponized, and it is still being weaponized today. Okay. So the influx of Goths destabilized Europe by reasserting those Neanderthal, Japhethite kind of dominance positions. So what was once a balanced corridor, right? Europe, Anatolia, Caucasus, Iran, India, became tilted towards the elitism, the colonization, and the suppression of spiritual and technology inheritances, or the co-opting and stealing of those, because they couldn't do them, they can't do it themselves. So the sack of Rome was just the outward sign of this deeper bloodline takeover. So we're going to go a little deeper. Wiedemann says a common Irish name is Sean, probably had its origin in Asian. Oh, yeah, Asian. Yeah, could be. Totally could be. Leon put up a good name page for the surnames behind the name. Thank you so much, Leon. That's going to be a super interesting one to look at. Okay, so we're going to go deeper. Everybody ready to go deeper? We're going to go deeper. We're not even made it to the tinfoil hat yet. We're going to go deeper. Let's talk about the different Gothic groups, okay? Because I'm using Goth as a very, even Neanderthal, I'm using as a very general term. And I'm saying, you know, in the beginning, all three were very balanced, and we had these great civilizations. We had trade, and we had stuff that was going on that was working pretty well until, right? So let's talk about specific Goths. So first, the Visigoths. This is the Western Goths, okay? They entered Roman territory in the 4th century CE. This is the story. They sacked Rome in 410 CE. That's the story. Where did they later rule? Spain and Gaul, both very Catholic areas, right? They used the Holy Roman Catholic Church as rulership, okay? So those are very Catholic areas, right? The Goths became the Holy Roman Empire because the Goths sacked the place and then everybody became uber Catholic. It's not a coincidence. It's the same thing. Yeah, deep state, Vincent says. So, their bloodline role, the Visigoths, okay? The classic Rh negative elite insertion here. The Visigothic kings established dynastic law, which was bloodline over land rights. This is where we get them saying bloodlines, okay? This is where we get the blue bloods. This is where the blue bloods started because you could see they were so white, so translucent, so sickly that you could see their blue veins. Oh, Adrian put in Gaul is France. So sorry. So people know. Now, how did they destabilize things? So they overthrew the Roman systems of law and order, replacing them with hereditary feudalism, right? We just talked about that, dynastic law. In Spain, they sort of absorbed this Visigothic Sephardic mixture, setting up the later bloodline conflict between the Gothic elites and the Semitic Hebrew remnants. We've talked about that before on the show. How did they skew the inheritance? Well, infrastructure, as Japheth, was elevated over spirituality, that's Shem, and technology, that's Ham, right? Infrastructure, this hereditary feudalist system. This is what the Visigoths did. There are still blue vein churches in the USA. Oh, yeah. Blue bloods is still a thing. So you're fine, Wiedemann 1111. Catch up when you can. Totally fine. So let's talk about the Ostrogoths. These are the Eastern Goths, okay? They settled in Italy under Theodoric the Great, who was the king of the Goths after the fall of Rome, okay? Now, Italy, another very Catholic region. So the Goths take over and everybody becomes Catholic? Interesting. They established Gothic kingship as divine right. Again, enforcing the bloodline purity, right? So more blue bloods, and that God said they could, right? Because we're weaponizing religion now. God said, I have a divine right of rulership, and I have to keep my blood pure. They destabilized the area because they overwrote Italy's Greco-Roman traditions. They pushed out the Semitic and Hamitic cultural remnants from that peninsula that had been there before. They pushed them out. right? And then they replaced Rome's earlier balance of law, philosophy, and engineering, because they had technology, with elite domination and militarism. This is where we're introducing militarism. Okay, so the Vandals. Some people don't know that they're Goths. They are Goths, just like the Alans and the Franks, right? So the Vandals migrated through Gaul, Spain, and into North Africa. They sacked Carthage in 439 CE. So this is Neanderthal coded expansionists, okay? Destruction as inheritance strategy, right? We see it all over the Old Testament because, they love that book where, God says, hey, that's your land. And they're like, well, there's people on it. And they're like, oh, kill everybody. We see that playbook over and over and over again, right? So destruction as inheritance becomes the strategy. But remember who these people became. Arabs, the current Egyptians, people who are hiding history. Hawass, anybody? So they severed the grain supply from Africa to Rome. All right. The collapse of the Mediterranean stability. Okay. Now, this is where I want to bring something up. It's not like the Goths and Neanderthals always work well together. If all they want is militaristic, hereditary control and infrastructure, aren't they going to fight each other to be king of the hill constantly? Constantly fighting over stuff. So here, this area, the Vandals cut off, right, grain from Africa to Rome. So the Mediterranean stability, gone. They targeted African and Hamitic technology hubs, which was Carthage and Egypt. There was a direct assault on Ham's inheritance, the technology, the agriculture, and the trade. Turned it off. Indigo says, jaw is gracious. Oh, that's cute. I like that. Comes from the Hebrew name Yachanan, to my understanding, is where we get John, Johann, Sean, John, Juan, Zhao, Jan. Oh, interesting. Adrian says, I remember what was in the doctrine of discovery. Whatever killing, stealing, and war, etc., that they needed to do in order to further the cause of the church, they were cool with it. Yes, same playbook. Perfect marriage of military and religion. Because they weaponize the religion, right? Leon says, wonder if they cut off grain from Africa to Greece too. Probably, because that whole stealing, hoarding, taking, never sharing seems to constantly happen. Wiedemann 1111 says lots of Jews lived in Iran. I think it had the second largest community of Jews outside of Israel 2,000 years ago. I thought that was Poland, but I may be thinking in newer history. Okay, so now we have the Alans. All right, now they teamed up with the Vandals. So this is Iranian origin steppe people who absorbed themselves into the Gothic coalitions. Okay. Can't beat them, join them, right? So they were hybrid Japhethite Iranian elements, right? They carried Indo-Iranian warrior traditions west, but subordinated them to the Gothic bloodlines. We're going to do all this and we're going to give it to you. Okay. Now, the Franks, which is where we get Francia and France from, the Franks. This was a confederation of Germanic tribes, the Merovingian bloodlines, and they claimed semi-divine descent. So this was a Gothic overlay with claims of this almost serpent ancestry that they're bringing up, but these were Goths, right? They align with that sort of dragon serpent ancestry. They crowned Charlemagne emperor of Rome. So now we're getting emperors, right? Fusing the Gothic elites with Christian hegemony, because the emperor of Rome, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, was a what? A Goth. Charlemagne. So they turned Christianity into a bloodline preservation tool. This is where we begin the whitening of Christianity and the divine right of rule, meaning I can do whatever I want. Manifest destiny, right? Wiedemann says, while there's a region called Aran in the Caucasus with Iranian roots, referring to that area between the Kura and Aras rivers, this is a geographical term, not a personal name. Oh, interesting. The spelling Aaron is a more modern, less common variation of the biblical name Aaron, adopted in Western countries for distinctiveness. Interesting. Leon says that is newer history. The Jews in Iran had to deal with small states propaganda. We'll say that they got bombed out of Iran, but not by the Iranians. Okay. Hi, Morris Travis. Thanks for being here. Adrian says Iran is still the largest group of Jews. Oh, outside of America, who's number one, and Israel's number two. The difference is that they are Ashkenaz now, not Sephardic like they were 2,000 years ago. That's what I was talking about, the mixing, right? Where we mix in, right, with the Sephardic, the Sephardim, okay? Then we have the house of Gotha, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, J-U-T-E-S, Jutes. Think about that word, Jute. Jewish. Anyway, they invaded Britain after Rome's withdrawal, okay? They carried the Gothic cultural patterns into the Isles, okay, overlaying the Celtic and the pre-Celtic, Brittonic, Shemitic, and Hamitic remnants. Cheddarman came from the Shemitic line, the ancient Britons, who were dark-skinned with light eyes and became the very freckled Welsh. They reclassified native Britons, okay, as subordinate in some way, even though that was their land. They created the British caste, which became the foundation of Anglo-imperialism. And these are all the people from the House of Gotha. And you can look that up. They tried to change it by changing their name to the House of Windsor, but it's still very much out there. Okay. Wiedemann says, so I would say the name Aaron does have its roots in Iran and came from Aaron. Could. Yeah, totally. Leon says, found it in my folder. This website has family crest and coats of arms. Interesting. Adrian says, like the fabric. I must have missed it. Sometimes I get to talking and I forget what I'm talking about. So some later continuities where we see this continue to happen over and over again. We have the Lombards, right? They ruled Italy after the Ostrogoths, and they embedded Gothic dominance even deeper because they were Goths themselves. They were from that bloodline, right? Then we have the Normans, who were the Northmen, right? These are Viking descendants, but they intermarried with the Gothic elites. So they carried that same bloodline agenda into England, Sicily, and they used them as fuel for the Crusades, weaponizing religion. They had Teutonic knights, they had Germanic orders, right? They had Gothic warrior priesthoods that institutionalized the suppression of Shem, the suppression of spirituality, mysticism, other beliefs. We're going to kill you for it. That's what the Crusades, right? Oh, Adrian says we're talking about jute. I didn't know that jute was a fabric. So I'm learning something new all the time. Now, the pattern across all the groups that we've talked about, okay? Bloodline preservation. The Neanderthals did it. The Goths did it. Everybody that came after the Goths did it. These are these people, okay? Gothic kingship always centered on dynastic inheritance and the blood purity. Wherever you see blood purity, you're going to see high Neanderthal DNA, and you're going to see that that was a place, that was a hotbed of the Goths. The Goths took over that area, okay? Suppression of balance, okay? This is their pattern, right? They want the bloodline preservation, and then they're going to suppress the balance. They don't want Shem's inheritance. They don't want that spiritual balance, right? They suppress that by weaponizing Christianity for control. They don't want Ham to have the Hamites to have all their technology. That's why they're constantly stealing, because they can't do it themselves and they can't let somebody else have control of that. It's always destroyed or stolen. Carthage, African trade. We see this in North America today. We see this across the West. They steal it, right? So the Japheth infrastructure gets elevated into empire, fortresses, militarism, all of this kind of stuff. The global result, Europe became a Gothic-dominated empire machine, later exporting colonization, slavery, and bloodline elitism worldwide. And we are in the fallout of that today. Each Gothic group, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Saxons, right, carried the Neanderthalic, Japhethite architect of domination into Europe. They displaced or absorbed balanced Indo-European systems and then imposed their bloodline hierarchy, militarism, and colonization, turning Europe into the staging ground for the global elite caste system that we have today. So, who's ready for a tinfoil hat?
Time for rest, time for rest, time for rest in the Lord. 10 for hat, time for rest, time for rest, time for rest, time for rest. CIA and Kelpro, it's your Pro. Secrets not supposed to know. Tartaria, vanished land. MK Ultra minds and trends. Iran Contra, secret dance. 10 for hat. 10 for rest. Time for rest in the Lord. 10 for hat. That road like Indians, they don't extol hidden history in this sky. Truth is hidden from your eyes. Whisper child fact alone. They can't gaslight no more. Time for rest. Time for rest. Time for rest, time for rest, time for rest, time making a cat. Tin for your tin for tapes that roll like cock in the truth is hidden. search, travel, fact, or Lord. They can't gaslight no more. 10 for 10 for 10 funk pass in a cab. Time for this. Time making a cab. Yeah.
All right, it's time for weirdness. So this is where we're going to get into Japheth to Neanderthal to Goths to Khazars to Ashkenaz. Okay, this is where we're going to get deep. And for anybody who wants to start saying I'm anti-Semitic, please go back to the beginning of the video, read my disclaimer, not anti-Semitic. Okay. Wiedemann 1111, not this coming Wednesday, but a week from this coming Wednesday during the Keys of Enoch, I'm going to get into that specifically, not specifically those regions, but that stuff. And you might be interested in the show I did called 2 Shades of Pale. Okay. So we'll look at that. Yeah, we're going straight to the secret detention centers with this one, Speed Man. Okay, so let's talk about the players here. Okay, so player 1, Japheth. We have Japheth's inheritance, infrastructure, empire, those kind of things. The line tied to Neanderthal admixture, RH negative markers, and the archetype of empire building and colonization. Then we have the Neanderthals and the Goths. Okay. They were very into the preservation of the bloodline purity, cold hierarchical control, militarism, and suppression of both Shem and Ham type inheritances. Then we have the Khazars. So 6th to 10th century CE. Sorry, my dog just brought me the ball. So have to help her. Okay. This is a Turkic, remember we keep talking about the same area, Turkic steppe polity based in the Caucasus and Volga steppe, okay? They descended from Japhethite, Gothic, Neanderthal lines in this area. We just talked about it. They converted en masse to Judaism, but it was political, not Shemitic. It was not spiritual. It was because they were surrounded. They had Christians on one side, Muslims on the other. So the nation became Jewish. Okay. Now, this mostly was the elites that did it. The everyday common Khazarian is just there, right? This is the national religion. Okay. It was an adoption of identity to preserve their bloodlines while gaining legitimacy among Semitic and Abrahamic peoples. Okay. The Semitic, the Muslims. Okay. So it wasn't true Judaism. It wasn't spirituality, but it was like this Gothic inheritance cloaked in a brand new Hebrew identity. We're now Hebrews because we said so. Okay. The Ashkenazi Jews, right, largely, but not 100%, largely descended from Khazars, elites, who migrated into Eastern and Central Europe. Their genetic signatures show heavy Caucasus steppe components, tying them directly to these very Neanderthal heavy Gothic lineages rather than to Shem's Near Eastern bloodline. Now, I don't even have to talk about how they literally named themselves after Japheth's great-grandson, Ashkenaz. His name was Ashkenaz. And they named themselves the Ashkenazi. They named themselves after Japheth's grandson. They didn't name themselves after anybody in Shem's line. They named themselves after Japheth's grandson. They're in the Japheth line. Remember, believe people when they tell you who they are, when they really tell you. So we have the Gothic method of destabilization, is what we're going to call it. This is the Gothic method. Okay, so we had the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, right? They infiltrated Rome, they toppled the old systems, they replaced balance with bloodline preservation, monarchies, and divine right of rule. They weaponized Christianity to suppress Shem and Ham, their inheritances. They spread this double caste system with the elites on top and the conquered masses in a caste system on the bottom. Now we have these previous Khazarian Ashkenazi elites, also what we call Zionists. Okay. They have infiltrated finance, media, politics, and global institutions. They say that it's anti-Semitic to say that, yet when you research it, it is factual. So I'm not being anti-Semitic. I'm not even talking about the everyday Jew, because the everyday Jew who's just trying to be a good person and follow their faith, they aren't benefiting from this infiltration of finance, media, politics, and global institutions. This is the elite, okay? They use Judaism as a shield, right? Everything's anti-Semitic, but they orient it towards bloodline elitism, right? It's a Zionist statehood. It's institutional control. It is not true Shemitic covenant. Both ancient Goths and modern Khazarians are Neanderthal-coded destabilizers, erasing balanced inheritance and imposing empire. Think about when Israel was invented. Prior to that, you had Jews, Muslims, and Christians all living in Palestine in what? Balance. We had the balance then. So they erase this balanced inheritance and impose their own empiric thoughts. Okay. So what are the mechanisms of this present day elitist control? Well, finance. It's always going to go back to the money, right? And I call it bloodline banking. So the same Gothic obsession with inheritance shows up in these family dynasties. Mentioned the Rothschilds. We also have the Oppenheimers, the Warburgs, right? The Rockefellers, right? There are 13 controlling families, okay? They control capital globally. Globally. World Bank is privately owned. Think about that, okay? When you, as a private owner of a bank, are richer than all the nations of the world, all the nations of the world go and borrow money from you. How much power do you have at that point? Adrian says, yeah, saying it's anti-Semitic to say it's a cover is the perfect cover. 100%, right? So we have finance, right? We have media and narrative control. So just as the Goths suppressed older mythologies and the goddess traditions, the dragons, the serpents, they had to get rid of all of that. These elites control mass media to overwrite history. We can actually, to this, like now in modern times, we can literally watch them try to do it. It's insane. It's a little crazy making. But they use mass media to overwrite history, silence dissent, and perpetuate their supremacy. Okay. Now we also have state power. It's always about power, right? Now we have Zionism. So we have this Ashkenazi Zionism. So like the Goths who sacked Rome, but then refounded kingdoms, modern Zionism is bloodline-driven empire project. It's not a spiritual homeland of Shem, right? It destabilizes the Middle East and pulls global powers into endless conflict. If this was really from God, if this was really Shemitic and a beautiful religious and spiritual movement, why does it include endless wars, murder, and genocide? It makes no sense, right? Absolutely makes no sense. Wiedemann 1111 says they were the Khazar Jews that moved to Poland 1,000 years ago, the ones that went to Israel and the war, or after the war, during the war. Adric says the Iron Bank will have its due. Yeah, and remember, we talked about the Iron Age, too. When did these financial institutions start? So we have the state-powered Zionism, right? And we have the suppression and ownership of spirituality and technology still going on, right? So Shem's inheritance to spirituality, right, it is co-opted through religious dogma, religious manipulation, indoctrination, political Zionism, and corruption of the Abrahamic faith. They're all weaponized. So spirituality is now weaponized, right? And if you do anything else, you're a heretic, a sinner, you're going to hell, right? Or they kill you in the Crusades. Ham's inheritance, the technology, is monopolized, weaponized, and patented, always patented. That's the way we can steal it, to prevent free access to energy, medicine, communication. This is all going on today. Think about all the African countries that the West is just mining, raping the land, stripping it bare, taking all the technology, stealing ideas, right? This is Ham's inheritance. Leon's putting some links in the chat. Oh, the Cohens. Yeah. Yeah, the Cohens. And if you research the Cohens, you might look up also Brian Taylor Cohen, who is controlling social media today. Okay, so we also have the signs of this Gothic, Neanderthalic, Khazarian continuity going on today through bloodline preservation. We have intermarriage among the elite families. Those 13 families marry each other. They don't really marry out. That echoes that Gothic dynasty, okay? We have this cold imperialism, right? We're prioritizing empire and hierarchy over harmony, exactly as the Goths dismantled the Roman systems. Wiedemann says Bibi Netanyahu is Sephardic. Actually, he's Ashkenaz. He is European. Global destabilization, so endless war cycles, economic collapses, engineered crises, all of these things keep happening, and it mirrors how the Goths destabilized Europe to seize control. It's exactly what they did in the what we call the United States now. They destabilized the whole thing to gain control. And then we have erasure of the knowledge of the true Hebrews. So the Black Shemitic Hebrews displaced, mislabeled, while the Khazarian Ashkenazi claim identity as the chosen, as if they are all 13 tribes themselves. And that was just like the Goths, who claimed Christian legitimacy while erasing older inheritances. Now, if you want to know more about these Black Shemitic Hebrews and the true Hebrews and where they are, because, maybe they're missing, next Sunday. So 1 week from today, we're going to be on part 4B of the Khazarian series, but we're actually going to be talking about the missing Hebrews. Now, part A, we talked about the Black Indians in the North American continent that, history was overwritten, and finding the actual receipts for that. So 4B is going to be the missing Shemitic Black Hebrews. Adrian says Netanyahu's real last name. Oh yeah, Milikowski, and he was born in Philadelphia. Leon says Netanyahu is Polish, and that is not his real last name. Yeah, you guys are saying the same thing at the same time. Yeah. And he went to college in the United States. Like, he's American. That I don't know where it's at, Wiedemann, and he may have a little bit of Sephardic, but somebody did a study on him, like some ancestral stuff, and showed that he's Ashkenazi, and he may have actually said himself that he's Ashkenazi at one point. I'd have to find it. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not saying he doesn't have any Sephardic. Okay. Appropriation Indigo Flow says, yeah. So anyway, we'll have that, the Missing Hebrews, next Sunday if you're interested in that. And I will have Adrian Hicks on again as my special guest. He's so knowledgeable about history and geography and those kind of things. It's so helpful to have him on. So if we look, yeah, Netanyahu had no Middle East accent in the 80s. Yeah, he's American. So let's talk about this framework, kind of, the nail in the coffin for the framework to prove that this is true. The modern Jews of Khazarian Ashkenazi descent, which is, they're estimating 80 to 90% of modern Jewry is Ashkenaz, okay, are the same archetypal force as the Neanderthal Goths. The Japhethite inheritance of infrastructure. That's what the Zionists are doing. It is twisted into this elitist empire. The Neanderthal fixation on bloodline preservation, still in the Jews, right? You can have sex with as many goyim as you want, right? You can do that. And it's not a sin in modern day Jewry. It is not a sin to have premarital sex with the goyim. It's experimentation. It's practice. Now, you can't do that with a Jewish woman because it stains her. But, the goyim are just, practice, whatever. But you definitely can't marry one. Bloodline preservation. They also have the Gothic method of destabilization and taken over. We're watching it in real time. These are not Shem's descendants, right? But rather the continuation of Japheth's Neanderthal line cloaked. They put on the Semitic identity. And then they said nobody else is Semitic. They say the Muslims are not Semitic. They're the original Semites. They say Palestinians are not Semitic. They are the Semites, right? They say that the Jews from Africa, they have a hard time calling them Semitic. At best, they're going to be called beta Jews, not alpha Jews. They're the alpha Jews, but beta Jews, kind of Jews, second-rate Jews, right? Yeah, Wiedemann says, plus many Jews change their names to hide their true identity. Yeah, we've talked about on this before. My favorite is, oh my gosh, Superwoman. Adrian, if you get a chance, you know what I'm talking about. Gal Gadot. Her name is not Gal Gadot. She's just trying to sound Semitic and Israeli. Adrian says Sephardic Mizrahi is only about 20% of the world's Jewry. Yeah. Spain, Italy, India, and Middle East are of Sephardic and Mizrahi. There may be some, right? Because, we look at the Ashkenazi elites taking over a lot of things, right? Wiedemann says they're the majority of the Jews. It's just the Ashkenazi try to control everything. I don't know about that because, again, studies we've seen, around 80 to 90% of the world's Jewry is Ashkenazi. Adrian says, yeah, Gal Gadot was Gal Greenstein. Sounds Polish, right? Definitely sounds Eastern. It doesn't sound like Israel. Okay, so just as the Goths toppled Rome and reordered Europe, the Ashkenazi elites, I'm not talking about the everyday Jew, are destabilizing the modern world to consolidate a global caste system with themselves at the top. This is why we keep hearing the phrase, the New World Order. And if you think that I'm being hyperbolic or this is a conspiracy theory, just Google United States presidents saying New World Order. They've all been proponents of one world government and the New World Order. Okay? There are modern elites and global powers that are all connected. Okay? They carry Japheth's inheritance of cold empire and bloodline purity, not Shem's covenant. They don't have it. Their present role in finance, media, Zionism, and global governance, and again, I'm not being hyperbolic or anti-Semitic. Just look it up. I'm saying their present role, being at the top and the owners and stuff, is the same destabilization strategy the Goths used in ancient Europe. Erase the balance, suppress the spirit, steal the technology. We saw this in the United every time they colonize, and entrench a bloodline elite system over the humanity that is there. We see it time and time and time again from these people, over and over and over. The only question is, why are we still playing their game? Why do we keep trying to beat them at the game that they made up? It's like we're playing Monopoly with somebody who made up the rules to Monopoly. They own the rule book, and no, you may not look at it. And they're also the banker. And every time you do something, they're like, oh, yeah, you can't do that. But then when they want to do something, oh, yeah, we can totally do that, because the rules change. It was set up for them to win. They set up the game. They set up the system. They set it all up for them to win and be on top at all times. I don't know why we continue to try to beat them at their game. It's never going to happen. We need to stop playing the game. The game requires us to be their little workhorses to get them money. We don't have to. The earth made humans. The earth, all it wants to do is to make things grow. It just wants to give. It wants life. That's what the planet does. It gives us everything that we need to survive. We don't need the game. We've just forgotten. All right, Leon says, 1933, Italy and Germany took a nice trip to North Africa. After that, the Ashkenazi became the majority. Oh, okay. Adrian says, take a look at Maggie's previous videos as we talked about, the Sephardics over the last couple months. Yeah, we really got into, we really haven't gotten to the Mizrahi, but we did talk a lot about the Sephardic. Yeah. And again, Wiedemann 1111, it could show up in his DNA. It could, right? But what we've looked at is that he's Ashkenazi. But again, nobody's 100% anything unless you're Marjorie Taylor Greene and you look just like a Neanderthal. Nobody's 100% anything. We have to look at majority DNA, right? When we look at where are the Neanderthals today, those hotbeds, those people are like 4 to 6% Neanderthal DNA, which is huge when you, but it doesn't seem it. It's huge when you compare it to the fact that anybody who is African, Afro-Indigenous from the continent, anybody with melanin has 0 Neanderthal DNA. So 6% is a ton. It's a ton. It's a lot. That means that these are the people who are bottlenecked their DNA, right? And when we look at when the Rh negative factor shows up, it proves the DNA. And I did a whole show going through all of these royals and how Rh negative and these immuno diseases show up over and over again because of that Neanderthal DNA bottleneck that they keep doing. So anyway, thank you guys for being here. It's a little bit longer than usual. It's an hour and a half this time. Hopefully you can make it this coming Wednesday for the Book of Knowledge, the Keys of Enoch. This is the final in the second section of the book. There's 3 sections. And so after that, we'll start the 3rd section and we'll be finishing that final 3rd. So we'll be doing that this Wednesday. And then next Sunday, like I said, we're going to be going into the missing Hebrews. This is part 4B. So I think you might hear some things that might be a little shocking that you never heard before. And we got some receipts. So hopefully I'll see you Wednesday. If not, I can see you next Sunday. And I'm going to show you a picture of my dog. Please like the video if you haven't already. It really helps the algorithm to know what kind of things you like. Share where you think it's appropriate, especially to someone who you think needs to hear it. And don't forget to check out some of the wilder Pivot Point Wednesday shows. And last, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, especially if you want to break down complex concepts that make the esoteric not soteric, helping you on your journey to become your most authentic self. By subscribing, you'll join a community that thrives on curiosity and growth, and you'll never miss out on insights and some wild discussions. Let's uncover the universe together.